All right, hi. My Screencast-O-Matic stopped at 15 minutes, which it's not supposed to do with the account that I use. So sorry about that. I kind of got clogged there at the end right when I was starting this video. So I am going to run the video again because it talks about the Willowbrook State School, and this is where we left off with the Monday class anyway, so this would be a good place for you guys to start. And Willowbrook was a state school, and up until this time in history, there was no laws protecting people with disabilities. As I think I mentioned to the Monday group, there were more protections legally in place for animals through the Humane Society than there were on hand for people with disabilities, especially the severe cognitive disabilities. So the only real solution or help that parents got was the option to send their child to an institution. Instead of keeping them at home, they would send them to institutions. And some parents sent them to institutions to completely cut them out of their lives, and others sent them to the institutions thinking that this would be a better place for them because they would get help, they would get training and support. But as we're going to see in this video, in the expose that was done by Geraldo Rivera, there was very little humane treatment for these people. So we'll watch a little bit of the video. I will stop it before the end.
It's a dark corner where we throw children who aren't pretty to look at. It's the big town's leper colony.
We were sitting on both sides of him, and he started to cry. And he said, "Do you see how it was? Do you see how it was? We were victims too," meaning the attendants or the people that worked there.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here and just kind of give you the quick synopsis of what's going on in this. What kind of got Geraldo going on this investigation, and then subsequently all the changes that came to special education after this was exposed, was that they found that there had been a serial killer operating out of Willowbrook State School, and what he was doing was preying on people, taking some of the residents out of the institution and molesting them and killing them, and no one noticed because no one cared about these kids, and there was nobody really. They disappeared, and there was no real concern. And this guy that was the killer was one of the workers at the school. So this just wasn't, when this was exposed, obviously, I'm sure it affected you in the same way that it affects everyone, is that something had to change. The government knew that something different had to happen. And so what we're going to take a look at then is kind of that historical timeline of the laws. So now what we've been talking about are the people that I mentioned, and we're right up here into normalization and deinstitutionalization. And this is where changes in the law happened. And one of the first laws that was brought into place was PL 94-142. And this particular law, I'm going to move to this one. I'm going to jump to that slide that talks about it. Was originally passed during the Kennedy years in I would say the late 1950s and into the 1960s, and then eventually the law was changed and revised to something called IDEA. But the reason I mentioned that this was put into effect by the President Kennedy, was he had a sister with a cognitive disability. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy, and she lived in a institution, as we saw, not Willowbrook, of course, but she was put into an institution that was actually about 6 miles from my home. So we all knew that the Kennedys had, his sister was living at this institution. It was a Catholic home for people with cognitive disabilities. It was called St. Coletta. You can kind of look it up on the internet if you're all that interested in it. But we would know that the Kennedys came to visit their sister, and her mother and father, Joe Kennedy, and his wife, Rose Kennedy, would come and visit her quite often, especially on holidays. And so, of course, having famous people like this in the community coming, everyone was very respectful and happy. It was a very little town, a town of maybe 1,000 to 1,500, where this large Catholic institution was located. It's closed now. It no longer runs because institutionalization is no longer really the way that people deal with students with cognitive or children with cognitive disabilities. So Kennedy had an interest in working with this, and so you're going to see that that's kind of a common theme in the next couple things we talk about. The Kennedys and his sisters and his sisters-in-law, and later down the road, the Kennedys established the Special Olympics, so they were very involved in this kind of thing. So in general, PL 94-142 was the first law that was put into effect to protect kids with disabilities. So some of the things that you're going to see here, looking at the words free and appropriate public education, and not just that they get a free, which is through public education, but appropriate education. So it's going to emphasize special education and services to meet their needs. So finally, there's a law that says you must, it isn't optional anymore, you will provide these kids an education, and the education must be appropriate to their needs. A second point was that not only were the rights of the children protected, but the parents were also protected. The parents now were able to have input and say as to how their children were being treated. And the other part were to help with different states and different institutions within the state to provide that education. And so you can see the focus on this is education for these. This law had a dramatic effect on special education, and it was the starting point. And this started, like I said, in the 1970s. 1975 was when the law was put into effect. That's pretty recent history, in my opinion, for this kind of legislation. So now what happened after that is then we moved to what's called IDEA. And a lot of people mistakenly say IDEA, but it's actually IDEA. And IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is what it stands for. And IDEA took PL 94-142 and built up on it. So not only are we responsible for educating these students, we have other responsibilities. And there's a lot to IDEA. And this link that I'm going to take you to in a bit links you to a handout that kind of gives you an idea of what IDEA is all about. And I will put a link to this handout on the Moodle course page. And I think it would be good for you to refer to that and take a look at the provisions of IDEA. So that'll be under the course assignments that you see as well. So different things that were added to IDEA is identification. So now schools not only had to serve the kids with disabilities when they were brought to their school, they had to go looking for them. Identification means that they had to do what's called child find. You have to go out and you have to find the children. You have to give even private schools an opportunity to refer their children into the system to be identified for special ed. Free and appropriate public education, that you heard already in PL 94-142, and that is referred to in special education as FAPE. So this is IDEA, but we say FAPE for this particular one. And then least restrictive environment, I showed you that graphic of the continuum of services. We refer to that as LRE. When we come to due process, the due process is that if a parent or a student doesn't feel that they're getting the services that they need or that their condition requires, there's a process where they can not just legally but also mediate with the school district before they take them to court to get those services that they want. So there's a due process is a legal term. Parents and guardians are to be consulted when it comes to special education. The school cannot mandate any kind of special education or provide any kind of special education without parent approval. Lots of guidelines within the individual education program plan. We call these IEPs, and we're going to take a really close look at those in lesson 2. A non-discriminatory evaluation means that the child must be evaluated in a way that doesn't penalize them for maybe speaking a language other than English. So we have to have assessment tools that are able to be given to a student in Spanish as well as in English or other languages, depending on where your school district, what their target languages are. And then there were some issues about confidentiality. Every parent is given a notice at the start of an IEP meeting. You'll notice that when you attend your IEP, where they they understand their rights, and the records of the child are kept confidential. And then there were guidelines also regarding the development of personnel through training. So that's kind of the big picture. There's much more to IDEA, and I'm going to take you to that document just so you can kind of get a quick overview of it. And I'm going to have to move it into my little box here. I think I can do that. All right, sorry about that, but I put this document so that it's out of the score. So I'm going to have to, well, there we go. Now I got it. Eventually I figure things out, right? So when you look at this document, it gives you the main provisions, and it talks about all the things I just mentioned, the FAPE and the non-discriminatory assessment. The parental safeguards is that document that you're going to see when you go to an IEP meeting. The case manager is going to hand a safeguards to every parent every time they meet. Here's the guidelines regarding the IEP, and you can see those are quite extensive. Least restrictive environment. Remember I told you there's a continuum. It's federally mandated that we put that child in the least restrictive environment. And then characteristics of effective special education are the second page of this document. So this one's linked on Moodle, and I would encourage you to take a look at it to give you some ideas of what the law actually talks about. Okay, I'm going to jump back to that legislation and litigation slide that I jumped over to go to PL 94-142. So you can see the dates of PL 94-142 were in the 1970s, mid-1970s, and then IDEA was built on this. And the first run at IDEA is still the laws that we use, and that was established in 1990, but it was repealed and updated in 2004. So that's kind of why you see them linked together like this, because IDE originally was put into law in 1990 and updated and appealed and repealed in 2004. Other laws that kind of fit into the special ed world is ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And as I talk to you about the law, you're going to find that when a teacher, a school district writes an IEP, they're using IDEA. That's the laws that govern them. When a person is writing a 504 plan, which I will show you examples of, that comes under the auspices of ADA. And basically ADA covers anybody, not just school-age children, but anyone with a disability, and stating that we cannot discriminate against them. We have to give them equal access to their services. So ADA also covers building, how buildings are set up. It covers something called universal design, where things like when you're walking in a public area and you see the signs on the wall that are in Braille and English to show a room number or whatever, that's a universal design option, giving someone with a disability equal access to that room and knowing where that room is. And then, of course, No Child Left Behind, which I'm sure you've talked a lot about in Ed 200, but the law of No Child Left Behind is to move towards standard-based reform, and that also applied to special education, where standards were used in creating the IEPs for kids with special education plans. Okay. I've already talked about FAPE, but I'm just going to maybe add one more piece to that. FAPE is also that it's a free and public education at no cost to the parents. That's what public education is. There is never any cost. If there is a cost for the service, which there would be in some cases, like especially if you're in a residential school or in a medical treatment program, and the school mandated that through their placement of LRE, the school has to pay that cost. The parents never pay that cost. So when a child goes to a private school, they lose the free and appropriate public education. So then they're participating in special education where it's free for the school district, where it's free for the families. But the public education would never pay for a private school placement unless it was mandated in the IEP. Not sure if that makes sense, but there's a lot of laws. When a parent puts their child in a private school, they generally surrender a lot of their rights for special education. And we can maybe talk about that a little bit more in class if you have questions on that when we talk about IEPs and such. Okay, So again, here's another continuum, another way of looking at the continuum, where we start with least restrictive and then all the way to the most restrictive. Like I told you, I'm going to be coming back to that so that you truly understand LRE. Okay. And then I talked about Americans with Disabilities Act already, so I think we'll move on to just a little bit about No Child Left Behind. As you might know with No Child Left Behind, this law told schools that if their students didn't hit certain benchmarks, the schools would be put on discipline. And that discipline usually involved financial restrictions or restrictions for what they could get from the federal government for services. So in a way, if kids didn't do well on their academic performances, the schools would not get resources, which kind of doesn't make sense if you think about it. You're penalizing the school for not doing their job. That makes somewhat sense if you look at it in that context. But to penalize them by not giving them money for the resources they need to improve didn't make sense. So that's where No Child Left Behind comes under a lot of fire. But some of the things that No Child Left Behind did is really put standards-based instruction on the line, which is important, that we have standards that we follow, that we have the end game and the mark that we're shooting for, so that we're all looking for the right thing. In fact, now what you will hear about when you go into your schools is ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. Barack Obama took No Child Left Behind, and he didn't throw it out like some people, I think, felt should happen, or maybe even wanted to happen. But what he did is he took No Child Left Behind and he tweaked it and adjusted it based on and added some things to it, and called it Every Child Succeeds Act, where certain things are still parts of No Child Left Behind are still in the law, but other things that weren't working were changed. And so we can take a look at that. So finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about with Lesson 1 is what happens when a child doesn't get their rights under IDEA. Then litigation will happen. And litigation is generally based on these ideas that school attendance is the right of every child. Every child has a right to go to school. So if there's something that's happening that's preventing that child from attending school, the district, the schools, and the teachers have to work to make that change. There is litigation that can happen when special education services are not provided and the parents want it and they aren't seeming to get what they need, they think their child needs. For example, if a parent felt that their child was needing speech and language services and they weren't getting them, and they had tried through the process to get those services, a parent could litigate to get those for their children. And the other side of it is true also. Sometimes schools have been sued when they've provided special ed services for their child when their parent does not want them to have it. Pull-out classes are examples of that, where a child might be sent to a pull-out class when there's never been anything officially put into an IEP that the child should go. It doesn't happen very often anymore, but it had happened in the past. There's been litigation involving the use of IQ scores and other tests, which are part of the testing process, which you're going to see in Lesson 2, but the litigation might involve how that test was used or how that test was interpreted. Here's times where when somebody was maybe assessed in the wrong language and the results showed that the child had a disability when in fact it was a language barrier that was happening, and that could be litigated as well. And then I think it's important for you to understand the Hudson versus Raleigh law, where when we talk about appropriate education, it doesn't mean education so that the child gets all A's, but an education in which the child achieves their best, where they're put into a situation where they can potentially achieve the best they can achieve. Whatever that best becomes is really, just like for any student, in the hands of the student and how the student works. Okay, so sorry about this having to come in 2 chunks here, but part 1 that you see mostly is where the Monday group needs to, the Tuesday group needs to start, as well as using this one, and then hopefully the Monday group just watch the second one, which I'll try to communicate. So that will catch you up then on Lesson 1. So your assignment It might be good to talk about that. Your assignment is to, hang on here, is to work with this particular forum. And you're to read chapter 1. I think I better go up here. Excuse me, guys. I'm going to roll. That makes me dizzy too sometimes. But your job is to read chapter 1. To start reading chapter 1 and to work on that permission slip. And then by next week, Tuesday, you should have this assisted forum done. So if you notice, chapter 1 is assigned already here. Chapter 2 is assigned on Friday. But you can start reading it at any time, obviously. But by next class period, which would be next week, even though we won't meet face-to-face, it's next week, you should read chapter 2 and do the assisted forum, assisted technology forum. And I'm going to refer to this in lesson 2 as well. So these are the 2 things that you should do and have done and in the can by the start of next week. So homework should always be done by Sunday night, because then the next week starts on Monday. Does that make sense? But if you have questions on that, just ask. So essentially read chapters 1 and 2 and do the forum. Hopefully that makes sense for you. Okay, I'm going to stop this one here, and I'm going to load up lesson 2 as well, and you should be watching the lesson 2 presentation, which is going to be talking about IEPs, IFSPs, and 504 plans.